Hi, thanks. Welcome to Workforce Priorities. And our topic today, as Tara just said, is organizational culture. Our presenters are Glenn Courounis, a seasoned human resources professional who has held senior positions in a number of different healthcare agencies, and Edye Schwartz, a private consultant and recovery guru, who is also the founding CEO of a multi-service agency in Putnam County, and more recently, the head of education and training at NIAPRS. So I'm going to turn this over to Glenn right off.
Okay, thanks, Naomi, and hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us here today. This is the third webinar in our series on the strategic role of HR. The first two were on HR strategy. The next one was on getting the right people in the organization. Today, we're going to focus on something that's really broad and encompassing, and that is organizational structure. So we've kind of started with the same slide, and we keep asking the question, does your organization have a culture that ensures that the right people with the right skills do the right things, that get the right results? And a piece that we're adding here today, because organizational culture is so important, is and will stay with you. And that's what you're hopefully setting a positive organizational culture will do for you. Next slide. Okay, we're going to start off with a poll. So we're asking you, the leadership at my organization walks the walk regarding our mission, vision, and values. And is it always? Is it sometimes? Or is it never? So we'll ask you to fill that out, and we'll see what the results are. So please take a moment to do that. So, okay, so always it's 43 people, somewhat, 67, never, 2, and we have a lot of no answers. So it seems that the most prominent answer is somewhat. So not unusual at all. But as we go through it, I'll come back to this thought. Next slide. So let's talk about organizational culture. You know, it really is. There's a couple of formal things here, and then some things I want to emphasize. First of all, basically, it's the accepted and preferred way to behave within the organization. That's the formal kind of definition. I always like to characterize it as the way we do things here. All right, and you know, I've spent some time as a HR practitioner. I've also spent some time as a consultant, and every time I go into a place, I would always try to you know, figure out what it's like to be in that particular organization. A lot of times I would head to the cafeteria and just listen to what people are saying. You know, you always find good information when you're heading to the cafeteria because people tend to let their hair down and really talk about how things really are. So anyway, so it's the way we do things here, and technically it's the shared beliefs and values. They are established by the leaders, and they're communicated and reinforced through policies and practices. You know, it's really the social order in the organization. And one of the key things about culture is the word I like to use is tacit. It's unspoken. It's often a mindset, and you know, a lot of these things, the way we do things here that go on are you know, often unspoken. I'll give you another example in a couple of slides about how you kind of look at culture. And you know, an important concept too is there's no one size fits all. There's no cultural template. We're not here today to say to you, you know what, you should really be this way, because culture evolves from values, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Next slide. So really, what's the function of organizational culture? Well, it's really the entire environment when you're in that culture. It's the environment that's set by the organizational leaders. It really establishes the identity of the organization, what people feel like when they're there. How can they feel like they belong to this organization that espouses certain things? And it really sets the context on the from the leadership side on you know, establishing the way the organization treats employees and, frankly, everybody, volunteers, clients, community. In large part, it's the organization's reputation. especially the visible part of this. The culture has an awful lot to do with how employees view the organization, how employees speak about the organization, and the reputation of the organization within the community. In many ways, it signals to the employees, in essence, what top management wants, how do we expect you to behave, and the kinds of behaviors that if you actually live those behaviors, what we're going to reward, both from, perhaps a monetary standpoint, or certainly a lot of the psychic rewards that exist in an organization. Next slide. Here we go. Here's the famous iceberg. All right. Whenever you talk about organizational culture, it seems a lot of the literature speaks about the iceberg. So, there's the visible part, just like an iceberg, where, it's the vision, mission, and values. It's espoused by the organizational leaders, a lot of the policies and strategies, and the external presentation or the reputation is what's visible to all. However, a lot of what's underneath, the unwritten rules, the relationships, how the organization is structured, what the values and norms are. And if you see along the right side of the slide, it's really the environment, the structure, a lot of the history and the rituals that go into an organization, the ethics, the quality, and just the overall feel of the organization to people who are in it, and frankly, to people who are outside of it. And let me point out too, I don't think, my view is that the visible and the invisible, or the visible and the internal, is not a fine line. There's a lot of blurring of the lines here between what is visible and invisible. But, it's the invisible, the people that are in the organization can really feel what's going on, and where there's a disconnect between what the organization says it is and what the organization really is, that's when you're setting yourself up for some pretty serious difficulties. Next slide. So here's the visible part. The visible organizational culture really are those core values that leadership establishes. The mission, vision, values organizations have, usually those as part of their statement. It's really the whole foundation in which the organization conducts itself. And those values drive the culture. And then the culture determines how people behave within the organization. So, the leadership sets the core values. Those core values establish the way the culture should be. I'll emphasize that. How it evolves might be a little bit different. And then the culture really directs how staff behave in the workplace. So, it's kind of this cascading effect from values to culture that really drives organizational behavior. Next slide. The values that drive the culture can often be seen as being on a continuum. And these are just examples of organizations and perhaps elements of their values and elements of their culture. So is the organization people-oriented or task-oriented? And rarely are they in one plane or the other. It's usually somewhere in the middle. Are they transparent communicators, or is it the kind of organization that just gives information on a need-to-know basis? Is there really a hierarchical decision-making, or is it an organization that really gives a lot of latitude to their managers as to how to make decisions? Is it rules-driven or results-driven? So is it, look, we're going to be pretty strict to go by what our rules, policies, and procedures are, or look, those are guidelines. We're really looking at what the ultimate results are. And then risk-averse versus change-oriented. I've certainly been in organizations that are risk-averse. They tend to be very conservative. Other organizations, really, they're looking to change all the time. They're constantly moving and shaking depending upon what the environment is and how they think they need to be able to move to get the results that they're looking for. Again, there's no size that fits all, so there's no right or wrong. It's driven by the values, and it's driven by the leader's behavior. And then, frankly, the staff and the organization take their cues from the leaders. And very often you'll see a situation where there's certain values. Those values drive the culture, but then, people do something that's in actuality a lot different. Or it could be that, there's a pretty good culture. It very much aligns with what the values are, and people are generally pretty happy. There's not necessarily a disconnect. The organization conducts business in accordance with their values, and those are the organizations, frankly, that tend to be the most successful and to keep their employees. Next slide. But the internal culture, what we might call the invisible culture, the stuff that's below the line, the stuff on the iceberg that's below the water level. This is when people are working there, they say, this is what it's like to actually and really work here. And, it can be in alignment with the stated culture, the mission, vision, and values, or it could be very different. A lot of that, frankly, is driven by the behavior of the key leaders in the organization. And when I say key leaders, I don't necessarily just mean executive leadership. I mean management as well. Next slide. So here's a little bit of a cautionary tale. All right. According to SHRM, the Society of Human Resources Management, they did an extensive study in 2019 of the impact of internal culture. And just take a look at these numbers. 38% of American workers are very satisfied with their current job. And you go, oh, okay, that doesn't sound too bad, until you look at the reverse, which is 62% are not very satisfied with their current job. 49% have thought about leaving their current job. 1 in 5 have left due to that workplace culture. 1 in 4 dread going to work and don't feel like they're respected or valued. There's a lot of work that I've done on organizational burnout, and there's something especially called Sunday night dread, when people just can't fathom leaving the weekend and having to go into the workplace. That's when you know you have a real toxic culture. The cost of turnover in the last 5 years, $223 billion. I know I don't have that sitting around in my pocket, and most organizations don't. So the cost of turnover because of poor culture or poor cultural alignment is really high. And then, and this is something I really want to emphasize because it really highlights the importance of management in an organization. 76% say their manager sets the culture for the workplace. So regardless of what the organizational values may be, and regardless of what the leaders may want it to be, it's the manager within that department that really sets the tone, sets the pace, sets the role for how people perceive their organization. This is why it's such a critical piece that managers be aligned with the organizational culture, because people see the organization as their immediate supervisor or their immediate manager. Those are the people that have the most impact on their day-to-day working within the organization. And those are the people that to the direct staff are really driving the organizational culture, are determining for that person, do I want to stay, or is this a place that just I don't feel I fit in? Next slide. And, even though the organization may have a larger and broader mission and value that says we're going to be certain things to certain people, managers may create the culture within their program or department that does not mirror the broader agency culture. Now think about that for a minute. It certainly emphasizes what I've just said, and that is what an important role that managers play in an organizational culture. So you can have an organization that says, we really value diversity. We really value the input of our customers. We want to make sure that employees are our most valued resource. And when a manager within a department doesn't value their employees, seems to not value diversity, doesn't respect and take input from the people who they work with, doesn't seem to care much or seems to denigrate their client base or their customers, you're going to potentially have a problem. Next slide. And when there is a disconnect between the values and the culture, both the invisible and the visible, the stated culture and the real culture, what it's like to work there, employee engagement, morale, and retention suffers. I've read a lot lately. In fact, I was just reading this morning about toxic culture and how detrimental it could be in an organization. This particular article I was reading was about Hearst Publications. Apparently, they just had a union election where, for the first time in over 100 years, critical members of the staff have voted to unionize. And one of the key issues about this is that the CEO set up what was called by many of the employees as a toxic culture, that the organization had crass and sexist behavior. That's a quote. And that's why they voted for a union to come in to represent them. Now, I'm sure as part of their value system, they didn't have a value statement that said, we are going to be crass and sexist to the employees in our organization. So you see how when you have values, their values were probably like a lot of organization values. We value our employees. We want to bring value to our customers. You know, whatever they are, whatever the broad principles are, whatever the broad values are, and they usually are cascaded down into, you know, those policies and procedures and a lot of the visible things that people see, both as a reputational piece as well as the feel in the organization, the environment that's created. You know, when the actual organization is crass and sexist, when the actual organization does not value employee input, when the actual organization appears to constantly denigrate their client base and speaks down disrespectfully to clients and employees, that's when people see the disconnect, and that's when they want to say, hey, this is not a place that I want to be. Next slide. So, you know, obviously one of the driving pieces of this whole series is about HR and what HR can do to strategize to make the organization one that people will stay in, that people value, and that people want to work in. I think HR has a tremendous impact on the organizational culture. And what they have to do, as I spoke about the disconnect, HR has to be there to ensure that there's a real alignment between the organization's values and their internal culture. You know, in all departments, you know, you can't have these outliers where you have these kind of, I'll call them rogue managers that are just not operating in the manner in which the organization wants them to. And it really sends a bad message to the people in that department. You know, we had a situation, as we talked about, with Hearst, where apparently the very top people really did not establish a good culture. This is where HR really has to step in and make sure that the management team is supportive of the organizational values. So when you're looking to have people there, when you're looking to promote people into your management team or higher up the management ladder, where you're looking to make sure you're bringing in people, you know, one of the key things is to make sure that you're asking questions of your applicants, of your people within, you know, do they actually live the organizational values? Do they represent who we want them to represent us as an organization? You know, HR has a lot to do with employee engagement and morale, and has to be constantly looking to take the pulse of the organization to see where people are upset, where there may be these rogue factions, that you know, HR has to really have a pulse on how engaged the employees are, and to really ward off and head off any situation, whether it's somebody who's a manager who just doesn't fit there. Frankly, sometimes you have to get rid of them in order to make things better, in order to live the organizational culture. Organizational communication is critical. I know I listed that as one of the things on the continuum. I think the transparent type organization with their communication tends to be an organization that people are more trusting of and value more. People want to know what's going on and not be held in the dark. These are the types of organizations that are going to attract and retain talent who align with the core values, as I said before. HR can establish a performance management system that values and rewards people who are aligned with the core values. Clearly, where there's a commitment to learning and development among people, among staff, where people are open, people are asking questions, people are willing to learn new things and to move up, and where there's good change management that are involved, that tends to be an organization that will align with the cultural values, and HR plays a really important function there. Managing diversity and inclusion, I mean, it's so important to have a diverse workforce for all the reasons that we already know, certainly to be reflective of your community and your culture. HR has a big part in driving that. And then, getting down to the kind of everyday policies and procedures, whether they be pay and benefits, work-life balance, time off, all kinds of things that HR does drive is really critical in making sure that the organizational culture is one that aligns with the values, that the right people are working in it, and that the staff is motivated to be in this environment that we all aspire to. Next slide. Really, it's ultimately about leadership. That is the primary driver of the culture. And good leaders have clear communication, set a good example, recognize and reward people, inspire and motivate people, have integrity, have high ethics, have great vision, focused on their team, are very supportive, have established clear goals, and frankly, are encouraging. People who are establishing that environment that people actually want to work in, that does indeed align with your organizational goals and objectives and your organizational values. So, Edye, why don't you take it from here?
I will. Thank you, Glenn. On the dot of 11:25, I'm impressed.
I told you, I promised.
So, first of all, great chat going on in the chat box. So keep that coming, because now Glenn can read them now that he's not talking.
Yes,
and it's great stuff in there. And so what I'm going to do now is talk about this wonderful information Glenn just passed on to us. And it's so incredibly important to understand all of this as you create a recovery-focused and person-centered organization, because that is the perfect example of what Glenn talked about as a strong, visible culture. And the truth is, it's also a perfect example of a strong, invisible culture. In the chat box, there were a bunch of talks about mission, vision, and values, and changing mission, vision, and values. And more often, you have mission, vision, and values that are recovery-oriented, and you don't actually function that way. But sometimes you're functioning in a recovery-focused way, but you go back and you look at your paperwork and your policies and your mission, and no one's looked at it in 20 years, and it doesn't match what you're actually doing. Any of those disconnects, as Glenn was talking about, can cause issues. So we're going to talk a little bit about how this shows itself in this recovery focus, and what to look for and how to make changes. Next slide, please. I think I have a little poll. I do. So we're going to put the poll up, and Tara's going to leave a minute for you to fill it in. So it's up there. Start to fill it in. I believe my organizational culture now currently supports recovery, trauma-informed practice. So that is yes, definitely, maybe somewhat, nah, not here. And that is your invisible and your visible culture. Because now that you know about both of them, your internal culture and your visible culture, it's interesting for you to think about whether you're supporting recovery-focused, trauma-informed, culturally competent, all the things that you really want to move towards. So fill in that poll, and now I'm going to sing and dance for you, and wait for that poll to fill in and Tara to put the answers up. And then we'll see what people think. And you know what? I mean, you don't have to, we're not going anywhere with the poll. It's anonymous. So please fill it in, all 227 of you. See what you think about it. And then we'll talk a little bit dive a little deeper, our favorite McTack term, into organizational culture. So let me get these percentages here. So yes is 23%, and somewhat 28%, and only 6% said no. So that's pretty good. 44% of you are not answering me. So I'll remember that for next time. But you know, I still think we could do a little improvement on that. So so let's see where we go with organizational culture and recovery. Tara, next slide. All right. So this slide really talks about what your services would look like in a recovery-focused culture. So if you had a clear vision, values, and mission about recovery, it would be the first start. That would be your invisible part of your culture. That you have things, and oftentimes, I don't know if any of you have this, oftentimes your mission, your vision, your values are posted up on the wall. They're made into poster boards, or I was in one place once doing a technical assistance, and they had painted it in the service area, kind of in calligraphy across the wall. So it's really important to know right off the bat that you have a clear vision, you have a clear mission, and that you have values that support recovery. Along with that, I think it's really important. I don't want to go through all of them for you for time, but what would your services look like if this were true, if your mission supported it? And it would look like asking participants what's going on, asking participants to be a part of program development, asking participants to be a part, an active part in their own services. And your services would be diverse, and they would really be about quality of life, not women's group, men's group, newspaper group. It's about, what do we want? What do all of you want? It's about, I want to live somewhere good. I want to have an air conditioner in this heat. I want to have a job. I want to go to school. I want to get married. I want to have a baby. And those are the things that people want. They want to date. They want to have a good relationship with family. Quality of life issues is what your menu of services would talk about. And it would be fewer rules. Look at, you want to get a good chuckle? Go back and look at your intake policy. Look at the rules for your program. When I first started as a direct care person, there were these contracts we made with people. I will not do this. I will not do that. And it never was about the staff. It was always about the clients. I will come. I will pay. I will do my homework. I will. You know what? Fewer rules and more flexibility in and out really shows a recovery focus. Because really what happens with behavioral health issues and recovery, we have different needs at different developmental times. And so fewer rules and more flexibility is an important one. And one of the most important things here is thinking about wellness rather than illness. I went to school in the dark ages and became a social worker in the dark ages, and it was all about symptoms and illness and maintenance. We're not talking about that now in a recovery-focused culture. We're talking about community participation and going to school and being well and taking care of ourselves in not only the psychotherapeutic ways, but in healthy ways like massage and and shiatsu and things that are good for us. So next slide, please. So let's take a look. Each of you, this is your homework. You could put it in the chat box or not, because in the chat box your name does come up. But you could just think about a little assessment of your own culture. So, do I need to change? Does my organization need to change? And there are many assessments out there. And we also have, again, some supplemental resources for you, which will be posted in a few days, along with the slide deck and the recorded slides. And that gives you a little bit more info on some assessment. But if you Google cultural assessments, you will find 8 million of them. For me, it's important to look at these 3 areas. What are the participants or the clients getting from us? How are the staff feeling about us? And what's our reputation? So in a recovery-focused culture, a culture that, as Glenn said, doesn't have a disconnect between the visible and the internal, the invisible and the internal, you're going to have good outcomes. You're going to have recovery measures. You're going to have a shortened length of stay because people are going to get better more quickly. And when you give out client satisfaction surveys, people are going to actually say, I like it here. I got what I needed. Not I found friends here, but I got what I needed. I came to go back to work. I got back to work. I came to keep my sobriety. I did. So that's important. Staff, these kinds of things. Remember Glenn said staff retention was important. You see how much money we spend, billions of dollars about replacing staff. When people get better and they're happy with coming there, staff don't have Sunday night dread. They like to come to work and they want to stay. One of the proudest things for me is that in my organization, people who I would interview would say, we watched your website daily for an opening so that we could come and interview. Because the reputation, which is the last one, was high. One of our largest referral sources was self-referral. People had a good experience and they referred other people. So those are the kind of things to do. Take a quick peek at your organization. Take a look at this. The slide will be up. You'll be able to see it, and just rate it in your head, or sit down with your manager and your participants and see where you come out in this. Next slide, Tara. So one of the things that I had written in the chat box is, you could tell I live in the boondocks north of New York City now, but I'm a good New York City girl, and I love to talk. So the best thing to do is to have a conversation, go deeper, explore questions. It's the best way to find out how your culture is. And if you set up a culture, or if you have a culture where people are afraid to talk, that's going to be obvious when you begin to have these questions. So here are some questions for you to begin to explore to see if your culture is supporting recovery. Do we seek feedback from service participants? One of the things that's fascinating is if you ask service participants for feedback and you ask staff for feedback, sometimes they're not the same. So if you say, did you meet your goals? And then you ask the staff, did that participant meet the goals? Might not be the same thing. That's another kind of disconnect you got to be careful for. But ask people, what do you think? Are we doing a good job? Do you remember, those of you who are old enough to remember, Ed Koch in New York City? How am I doing? It's a good thing to ask. And then when people tell you, do you do anything about it? Does it feed back to management? Are anything changed? I mean, I remember I had this consumer advisory board, and they said things like, we had tiny little waiting room outside, and you could hear everybody's business at the window. It was very small. And they said, why don't you put a radio up by the window so that we can't hear? And I put a radio up, and it worked really nicely. But I answered because that came to me. I wasn't in the advisory board, but it came back to me in a set feedback mechanism. So those are the kinds of things. These are the kinds of questions that are important. Look at your policies, your staff, your HR policies. Are they supportive of staff with a lived experience? And do you have an organization where staff feel safe to share their own personal experiences with behavioral health issues and trauma? We don't go into this field for the money. You all know that. We can have 75 things in the chat box now, because that's not what we go into it for. We go into it to make a better life for people. And oftentimes, we're trying to make a better life than we had ourselves. And so many people who work, staff, workforce in the in the behavioral health field have their own lived experience. And is your organization one that's really comfortable hearing that, and also then supporting that and helping people to use that lived experience in the best way in their services, in their treatment and rehabilitation services? So again, these are just some questions for you to ask. Tara? So I'm gonna just throw this up and say that for me, transformative change is the only way to go. But it may not be the way that you can go. If you need to change, there are different routes to change. And if you're, a lot of times I get called into places because they've done additive change. So they've hired peers, or they get a pros program, or they started some harm reduction, or they have a few trauma groups, and it's not working. People aren't coming to them. They're losing staff. It doesn't fit in anywhere. It's because it's additive. It's because the culture didn't change to support it. So additive is sort of the easiest, but it is not the way for long-term recovery for a system. Selective is interesting. You could start pilots, and you often wind up having self-selective pilots where people kind of develop these little programs that are a little oasis in an organization where the culture may not be really supporting recovery. But the real way to make change is from the bottom up or the top down in a real cultural way with values and mission and vision, and really have that drive practice changes, policies, procedures at all levels of your system. Next slide. And not easy, by the way, and not overnight. Oh, no, that's okay, Tara. Go to the next slide. I'm just continuing to yak. That's probably a 3 to 5 year process, by the way. So, don't lose hope. So let's talk a little bit more about establishing a recovery culture. So I think the important things here are that that you want to just keep asking these hard questions and keeping up the conversations, and you want to make sure that you're really talking. You have to continue to talk about this. You talk about, what if I'm not recovery focused? Well, then keep talking about it. Hold people accountable. The question of, do you walk the walk, or do you talk the talk? Or our leaders and ourselves, are we living the cultures? And again, the disconnect. Is there consistency between what we say and what we do? Do we believe that if we say that we include peers at all levels, then look, does your C-suite have people with a lived experience working there, or just direct care? If you believe in diversity, are there people of color working in your upper level management, or only in your direct care? Are you consistent? Are your leaders living the culture? And I think that these are the important things. And if they're not, begin to talk about it. Begin to share. Next, Tara. So resistance to change is normal. There are people who love change. Glenn talked about this a little. There are people who don't love change. I love change. I could change my furniture. Now that I'm old, I can't move my furniture anymore. And I live with a man for 30 years who hates change. So getting him to move all the furniture is not an easy thing. So, there are people who love to change. There are people who don't like to change. I would ask you to think, do you have your own seat at the kitchen table or the dining room table? I like to sit in a different chair every time I sit down. My husband likes his seat. It's all, even on a round table, and he's always at that seat. So remember that human beings are complicated creatures, where that's what makes us so interesting. And we like change, we don't like change. Sometimes resistance to change is just lack of readiness to change. You may not be in that place where you're ready to make a change, and you may need to develop that readiness. So remember that people are afraid of what they don't know. People are most comfortable with what's known to them. People get nervous when they're not under control. I'm laughing because I'm talking and reading at the same time about people who like change and don't like change, which is really wonderful. Sometimes people don't understand the change. A big one is not seeing the benefit to the change. There's a lot of lack of trust, and people are afraid to change. When I do change assessments, I use any of you out there who years ago ran an IPRT know about the Boston Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation Readiness Assessment. And that says in these 5 areas, people need to be ready to change. There has to be some kind of unhappiness with what you currently have. If you're not dissatisfied with what you have, you're not changing. And then there has to be a belief that that change is going to be positive, that it's going to be possible, and that it's going to be supported. And then there has to be an awareness of who you currently are. If you know who you are, where you are, and where you want to go, you can make any kind of change you want. So you have to know who you are and what you're comfortable with. And that 4th one is that environmental awareness, which is you have to know that this is really possible, that there are other places out there that function this way. The truth is, when I shifted to a recovery-focused organization, we made money. We made more revenue than before. And there are lots of reasons for that, which I don't have time to go into. But the issues are, know that it can happen. And the last one is, I'm going to spend a little bit more time with, but it touches that last bullet. The last one is a sense of personal closeness or a leadership issue. One of the things that I love to tell the people that I supervise, and usually I supervise higher level management or middle management, and I'll say to them, go ahead, take a chance. I'm right here, and I'm not going to let you look stupid or fall on your face or hurt anybody. That way, you can foster that creativity. People can take a chance because they're not alone. So if you've got resistance to change and you want to know that someone is behind you so that you can take those chances and move forward. Last slide. And, you know, Glenn touched on this, and I'm going to touch on it again because that's how important it is. The truth is that some of the most important issues of what I just told you on assessment for change is, to me, that someone has to be somewhat unhappy with what's going on, and there has to be a leader who's going to say, I'm going to be there for you, with you, every step of the way. Because leadership is what really gets results. Leadership is what allows the vision to become a reality. It not only communicates the vision, it operationalizes the vision. Leadership can begin to operationalize mission and vision and values into everyday practice. And leadership makes sure that the vision is shared, that everyone believes in the vision. One of the chats that I read while Glenn was talking was someone who said that they left an organization when there was a disconnect, and another person said they redid the vision and mission. So disconnects can sometimes point these things out if a leader is on top of their game and making sure the vision is shared. And vision should be used to inspire and shape all future activities so that, you know, especially now when money is so tight for all of you high-level managers out there, sometimes we can wind up having mission creep, where you're chasing the money instead of chasing your mission or keeping to your mission. We need the money to stay alive, but going out into getting money for areas that don't support our mission gets us into big trouble. So we need the vision and the mission to be able to guide where we go. And leaders can set up that toxic culture that Glenn was talking about in about 3 seconds. And they can get rid of it as well. They can create a situation where people do not treat each other in that kind of way. One of the things that I had said and followed through with discipline is you may not backbite here. You may not talk to each other that way. You may not talk to clients that way. Being very clear about what you can do and what you cannot do. And if you do, it winds up in a disciplinary action. And, look at your policies. Look and see what you can do and what you can get away with, and are we following it? So leaders have the ability to do all of that. Leaders also should use all the info that we've talked about, all the information that we get, and make it a constant part of the organizational change. Every time somebody says to you, put up a radio in the lobby, let's change the configuration of this group room. I don't want to tell, a bunch of people told us, we had an intake process where people wound up telling their story 100 times, not very trauma-informed. People said, please don't make me tell my story 15 times. It hurts too much. We changed that. And that was quite a while ago. It was before we were so on top of trauma-responsive organizations. Listen. Leaders listen to what people say, and they make change based on it. And the other thing that leaders do is what we were talking about before. Leaders build organizations around exemplary performers. There are folks in your organization, and you are probably one of them, who do a bang-up job. And your leader, the leader of your organization, should support that and build your organization around that. You could mentor new staff. You could be, given certain roles in committees. You could be active. So leadership becomes one of the most important things, not just to make rules, but to assure that the staff, the clients, and the community are moving in the same direction as a mission, vision, and values in a recovery-focused and trauma-informed and person-centered, culturally competent way. I can't stress enough how important leadership is. And for me, I am going to end on that. And next slide, Tara. Do we want to do that before we do Q&A, Naomi?
I would rather do Q&A because I've got a whole bunch of questions for you guys.
Okay. Well, then, Tara, why don't we
go back
to leadership and sure. And let me just say thank you, all you guys, for writing so much. And I'm going to ask Tara to send me the log after so I can look at everything that was written while I was going on.
So one of the questions that I have, I'm struck by the contrast between the emphasis on the importance of leadership and the fact that 62%, as you said, Glenn, are less than happy, often because of leadership. So what can we do to hold leadership accountable when they are not aligned with our wonderful mission, vision, and values?
Well, again, this is my view, this is where HR has to step in. I mean, I guess my view is HR tends to be somewhat of a conscience of the organization. And, if HR is doing their things right and walking around and talking to people and talking to managers and talking to staff, they're gonna understand when leadership is not walking the talk. And then, real HR folks have to be willing to take some risks and then present information to leaders that say, you know what, we say this, but we're doing this, or the impression is this. And it goes beyond, frankly, just walking around and getting a feel. It's doing, formal employee engagement surveys. Even if they're pulse surveys that you do kind of quickly, at least you'll have solid data to go to leadership and say, look, these are my observations, and here's the data to back it up. So, I think HR has an awful lot to do with that. I think managers have to have a good relationship with HR and with the leaders to be able to, speak inconvenient truths, and make sure people can align, their behavior with values. I think, leadership role modeling, as Edye said and as I said, is so critical that, you need to make sure that everybody's on the same page.
So, I'm going to jump into Naomi, and also there was another question because I said something about bottom up leadership, that you can make change from the bottom up or the top down, and it kind of goes with this question, which is that the easiest way is when you're leader. I went in and I founded this organization. I was the CEO. I said policy and procedure, everybody had to follow it. That's the easiest way to make change. I'm not going to lie to you. But if you don't have that, there's a lot of questions here about what do you do if your leader doesn't do that. And my answer to you is it's a longer process than even the 3 to 5 years. And you need to begin to ask these questions we asked. Go to the supplemental resources when they come out. Take a look at the questions. Remember, we do still live in America. People protest. I'm not saying a protest. I'm not saying a strike. But there are many, many folks who begin to change things from the bottom. The peer movement grows that way. And look how powerful it is now. Managed care companies want you to hire peers. Hospitals hire peers. And there was a time when the peer movement was nothing. And so I think what's important is if your leaders do not walk the walk, talk the talk, you need to find a way in a respectful fashion, because they are the leader, to be able to bring up these conversations that are important. Bring up these questions, the questions I posed, just a couple of them, and there's more in the supplemental resources. What do we have? Bring in other people. You have to develop their readiness for change. Bring in organizations that have moved to a recovery focus, that are walking the walk, and show your leader that the revenue is better, that the staff retention is better, that the reputation in the community is better, so you get more grants. You can put all this not just in touchy-feely words, but you can put it into words that mean something to our C-suite managers. And it's a long process, but it can work. I've seen it work.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears completely. I'm looking at the clock very carefully. Another question that came in was about how COVID has shifted organizational culture. So stress has gone up. People may be working remotely. I know there's often a lot of, I was actually saying to somebody earlier today that I wish I could have a book written about all the text messaging that goes on outside of the Zoom call. It's all the kind of cattiness. How do we address those kinds of cultural issues?
Well, I think, for my part, I've actually done some work on this, and I had a seminar that I helped develop on this about a month ago called What It Would Be Like to Return to Work. And one of the key things, and I work with some behavioral health folks to put together the presentation. And one of the things that we came up with was you really have to be cognizant of people's emotional and behavioral health in this time. You recognize that people are really on edge, that you have to be supportive when perhaps as an organization you weren't as flexible in the past. I think you have to be very flexible now. I think people need more encouragement, more recognition for doing great things. As a society, what did we do? People were outside at 7 o'clock every night at the beginning of the pandemic, clapping and appreciating healthcare workers. I think we have to take that concept and bring it to our organizations, appreciate what people are going through, appreciate that this is a extremely difficult time, and be very much more understanding, and also to listen a lot more than you did in the past, because people will tell you what's going on if you're willing to listen and then problem solve to try to figure what you can do to make things better.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I think whether it's remote or in person, I want to make it clear that, go back to that thought that that change is not always, lack of change is not always resistance. And I think if we get into the thought that our leadership is awful, they don't want to change, they don't want to make it good for us, you're not going to get anywhere. The first step is always, maybe they simply don't know how to do it a different way. And maybe they're open to hearing a different way to do things. And maybe for something like, the texting, the backbiting, as simple as what I did and said, no, we don't treat people that way here. We just don't. And maybe there's those conversations that have to happen. And I also don't want to be Pollyannish. I worked for someone once and I had to leave. The person didn't respond to anything I'm saying. The person touched personal buttons for me. It wasn't a good match. I moved on. And sometimes you have to do that as a direct line staff.
Right.
But first try. First try to come at it from, they're not a mean. No one goes into this field, leaders or direct practitioners, to be mean. We go in to make a difference. But leaders, we're not born with this ability to know what to do. Every day you're faced with stuff you have no idea what to do. So input is a good thing, and see if you can give the input in a way that doesn't make the person defensive.
It's interesting because you're talking about it, if taking kind of a recovery-oriented perspective, it's about anticipating and believing in everyone's good intentions and their rational behavior, even when it seems irrational to someone who doesn't know the backstory. And we need to do that same thing with our colleagues and our leaders, as well as with the people who we're working with to improve their lives. Kind of all the same.
Well said.
So, and it's 12 o'clock noon. So just to let you know, we will be having a pre-recorded session on interviewing tools on August 13th. That'll be released on August 13th. And then we're going to take a little break for the end of summer / Labor Day vacation time. Even if we're not all able to go away to distant lands, we could still be in distant summer places. And so we'll be back in September talking about performance management and employee engagement. And then our last wrap-up piece will be a release of a full tool package that includes a pre-employment screening tool, interview questions, performance management tool, et cetera, all in one place. And we'll kind of talk about how that all relates to everything else, plus other resources. So we hope that you'll tune back in around August 13th, and then we'll see you again on September 17th. Thank you very much.
Have a good day, everybody. Thanks for Naomi and Tara. And Glenn, of course.
Take care.